Hey folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me at the art table again today. I apologize if my voice comes off a little scratchy. It is the middle of February and there's a lot of nasty stuff going around. Hopefully, I'm not too unintelligible here. Not too long ago, I made a video on the subject of legacy, and I'm a big fan of legacy both in general and as a tool for storytelling. However, when you love something, especially as a tool, it's important to understand both the strengths and the weaknesses of that tool. And if you're telling a story about something and you show only its good sides and none of its bad sides, well, that story is not going to feel very authentic to people. So I thought it was a good idea to add a few words as an addendum to that video on the subject of the dark side of legacy. And it turns out that the dark side of legacy is actually twofold. So I'm going to do two separate videos on it. One of these is the mentor as the villain, and that is going to be coming probably next week. Today, I wanted to talk more about tragedy, which is often the dark side of legacy. And to illustrate what I mean by that, I'm actually going to extend my previous example. So if you haven't watched my video on Rakugo and legacy, go back and pick up that because we are going to be building on that as we discuss how legacy and tragedy often go hand in hand, and how you can't really look away from tragedy when you're discussing legacy because it feels like it's always a part of it. In order to understand how tragedy bakes itself into legacy, we need to take a look at this character, and this is Kiroku Kashiwaya, a name which I've probably butchered the pronunciation of, but I've never heard it before, so this is the best I got. Now, if you're wondering how this guy bears on the tragedies of akane-banashi, you have to understand that this is the man that taught Rakugo to the men we now know as Shiguma and Isho Arakawa. Decades ago, in the aftermath of World War II, Kiroku Kashiwaya picked up a couple of street delinquents and started to teach them the art of Rakugo as a way to give them something a little more meaningful to fill their time with. Sure, they had a community and something like a job, but they didn't seem to draw a whole lot of satisfaction from it. Kiroku pulled them out of a street fight with a bunch of Yakuza thugs, and quite naturally became their mentor. Unfortunately, Kiroku's mentor was Miroku Kashiwaya. Miroku was not just the leader of the Kashiwaya school, but he was the bearer of a myoseki, a stage name that has been passed down from generation to generation. This was a person of quite a bit of importance in the Rakugo world who looked upon Kiroku as his best pupil and the most likely person to inherit his name. But he didn't approve of Kiroku's two disciples. He thought they were very lowbrow, which is an interesting position for someone who performs Rakugo, a series of stories about very blue-collar people. But then again, these things do change over time. Shakespeare is viewed as very highbrow now, but in the past, it was very lowbrow stagecraft. So I'm not going to hold that against him too much. The point is, Miroku Kashiwaya wanted his apprentice to choose better students. And because of the way traditional art forms work in Japan, Miroku has a lot of sway over his student, even though Kiroku is now a full shinichi and a headliner, what they call an ukanban. So Miroku demanded that Kiroku expel his disciples, and in exchange he would allow Kiroku to inherit the myoseki and become the next Miroku and leader of the Kashiwaya. This is a pretty strong inducement, but due to differences about what Rakugo was, Kiroku chose to instead give his apprentices their debut performance under the Kashiwaya name. For this, he was kicked out of the school along with both of his apprentices, an outcome that seems to have left the Kashiwaya and the Arakawa at odds ever since. Because you see, Kiroku Kashiwaya would go on to found the Arakawa school. In order to do that, he chose to take up a different legacy. Rather than taking the legacy he was offered and take the name of Miroku Kashiwaya, he chose to take up the name Shiguma Arakawa and turn that into a myoseki. Now, a myoseki is a pretty big deal. It says a lot about the performer who previously used the name because someone else thinks enough about that performer to give up the stage name and the presence and the reputation they have spent their entire career creating and take up someone else's name. And it is definitely a bit of an indictment to turn away from that kind of legacy when it is offered. So not only was Kiroku saying something about Shiguma Arakawa when he took up the name, he was also saying something about his old master when he rejected that name. In short, Kiroku was building a legacy, but he was also perpetrating a tragedy. He was choosing to give up everything he had banked his early career into. He was choosing to give up the stage name of Kiroku Kashiwaya. And that is a bit tragic. He was a very good man and a good performer. And believe me, those things rarely go hand in hand. The only other thing that he took away from the Kashiwayas with him was his 2 apprentices. And in order to preserve a part of what he had given up, he broke his name in 2. He gave one of them the name Kisoba Arakawa, and the other he gave the name Rokuen Arakawa. Thus, the Ki and Roku of Kiroku would live on, even though the name of Kiroku Kashiwaya was doomed to fade into obscurity. So, out of this tragedy comes a new legacy. The legacy of Kiroku was broken apart and given to his 2 chief students. But we know those 2 students no longer use that name. Rokuen inherited the Myoseki. He is now Shiguma Arakawa. And whatever happened in that process of inheritance seems to have upset Kisoba to the point where he changed his own stage name and became Isho Arakawa. So when the legacy of Shiguma was passed down, a new tragedy takes place. The legacy of Kiroku disappears. Then eventually we learn from the 3rd Shiguma, the one who is currently mentoring Akane, that the full legacy of Shiguma has not been passed down. One of the 2 preceding Shigumas, we're not really sure which one, had an unfinished story, an idea for a performance piece that he never perfected and brought to the stage. The 3rd Shiguma has spent his entire career contemplating this story, but he has never perfected it either. So for all the bickering and all the infighting that these various legacies have brought about as they are passed down from one generation to another, the most important part of them, the stories that make up Rakugo, linger incomplete. And that is where we stand as Akane begins to grapple with her master's legacy, as well as her father's legacy. And remember, the loss of Shinta Arakawa as a performer, his return to the identity of Teru Osaki, is in and of itself a tragedy because a talented performer was lost in the process. These are the tragedies that Akane must confront as she prepares to build her own legacy for the next generation. These things are not pleasant. There are elements of class discrimination, of broken dreams, of sibling rivalry built into this story. And they are very uncomfortable because we can all imagine a different world where these rivalries and these embittered prejudices did not lead to all the disappointment they did lead to. We have these situations in the real world as well. Many of them are in fact much more severe than these rather minor emotional hurdles faced on the way to perfecting an art form. But they ring true precisely because they are so much like real trials and tribulations. And so if we wish to tell a good story about legacy, we cannot set them aside. Again, I understand why some people would choose to ignore legacy so they can sidestep these issues. But I am not here to ignore legacy. I am here to embrace it. And embracing it means embracing the tragedy that lives on the dark side of legacy. No one ever fully accomplishes everything they want in their life. That is part of why you have to pass it on to the next generation. And part of the burden of the next generation is sorting out all that unfinished business and making the most you can out of the legacies you are left. That, I think, is actually a strength of legacy as a storytelling tool. But it is also part of what makes it so very, very heavy. Now, as I said, I like Legacy as a storytelling tool, and if you want to read some stories I've written that include that as an aspect, you can try picking up Have Spell Will Travel, a collection of 4 novellas and short stories that I published last year on Amazon. There's a link where you can pick that up down in the video description. Let me know if you think you can tell a story about Legacy without tragedy down in the comments below. There's a like button and a subscribe button down there. You can use those as you see fit, and I will talk to you later.